My son was standing on my doorstep holding white roses, the same flowers he had brought to his father's funeral while I sat there counting the $3 million his uncle had just transferred into my bank account. The irony didn't escape me. David had chosen flowers that symbolized new beginnings, because this was going to be a fresh start for both of us. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the past week carefully planning exactly how I was going to make him pay for stealing my home and forcing his 64-year-old mother to sleep in her Honda Civic for 2 weeks. If you're watching this, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Let me rewind and explain how a retired elementary school teacher from Ohio ended up homeless, then a millionaire, and then plotting revenge against her own child. My name is Margaret Sullivan, but everyone calls me Maggie. And 6 months ago, I truly believed I was the luckiest mother alive. I had a beautiful house in Westerville that my late husband, Tom, and I had paid off after 30 years. I had a comfortable pension, and I had a son who seemed to genuinely care about my well-being. David called me twice a week. He came over every Sunday for dinner. He always insisted on helping with yard work or small repairs around the house. "Mom, you're getting older," he said one evening in June as we sat over pot roast. "What if something happens to you in this big house? What if you fall down the stairs?" His wife, Vanessa, nodded sympathetically. "We worry about you living alone, Maggie." Their concern felt sincere, loving even. David had inherited his father's earnest brown eyes and soft-spoken nature. And when he looked at me with that worried affection, my heart melted. That's when they presented their solution. "We've been thinking," Vanessa said gently. "What if we moved in here with you? We could take care of the house, help with everything, and you wouldn't have to worry anymore." David leaned forward eagerly. "And Mom, to make it official and protect your assets, we should probably transfer the deed into my name. That way, if anything happens, there won't be any legal complications." I should have seen the red flags. I should have questioned why a 39-year-old man and his wife suddenly wanted to move in with his elderly mother. Instead, I saw it as an answer to prayers I didn't even realize I'd been saying. They moved in that July, and for exactly 6 weeks, everything was wonderful. David mowed the lawn and fixed the creaky porch step. Vanessa cooked elaborate dinners and redecorated the guest room. They insisted on paying all the utilities and groceries as their contribution to the household, but fairy tales don't last, especially when they're built on lies. The first crack appeared on a sweltering August afternoon when I overheard David on the phone in Tom's old study. "Yeah, the deed transfer went through last month," he said. "Once we get her moved out, we can renovate the whole upstairs and probably get $750 for it in this market." My blood turned to ice. "Moved out?" I stood frozen outside the door, gripping the door frame so tightly my knuckles turned white. That conversation changed everything, though I was too shocked to react right away. Instead, I became a spy in my own home, noticing things I'd previously ignored, like how David and Vanessa had started receiving mail at my house even before they officially moved in. Like how Vanessa rearranged furniture and quietly removed my personal photos, saying she just wanted to freshen up the decor. Like how they both grew irritated whenever I wanted to use the living room in the evenings, suggesting I'd be more comfortable upstairs in my bedroom. The second conversation I overheard was even worse. It was a Tuesday night in early September. I'd come downstairs for a glass of water and they were in the kitchen, their voices low but tense. "She's getting suspicious," Vanessa said. "Yesterday she asked me why I was looking at real estate websites." David's response made my stomach drop. "Then we need to move faster. I'll call Peterson tomorrow about the power of attorney papers." Power of attorney. The words hit me like a slap. They weren't just planning to sell my house. They were planning to have me declared incompetent so they could control everything I owned. 35 years of marriage to Tom, 30 years teaching third graders, a lifetime of careful saving and responsible living, and my own son was plotting to take it all. I crept back upstairs and sat on my bed in the dark, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it downstairs. How long had this been planned? Were David's Sunday dinners and concerned phone calls all part of some elaborate scheme? I thought about the deed transfer I'd signed so trustingly, believing it was nothing more than paperwork meant to protect me. The lawyer David insisted we use turned out to be his golf buddy, someone who rushed me through the paperwork with barely any explanation at all. The next morning, I called my own attorney, Harold Weinstein, the same man who had handled Tom's estate. "Harold, I need to understand something about my house," I said carefully. "If the deed is in my son's name, but I'm still living there, what are my legal rights?" The silence on the line lasted much longer than I expected. "Maggie," Harold finally said, "if the deed is in his name, then he owns the house. You're essentially a tenant at will. He could ask you to leave at any time, a tenant at will in the house where I raised my child, where I nursed my husband through cancer, where I planned to spend my golden years. I hung up the phone and slowly walked through the rooms that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The kitchen where I had packed thousands of school lunches. The living room where David took his first steps. The master bedroom where Tom died in my arms 3 years ago. None of it belonged to me anymore that afternoon. While David was at work and Vanessa was at her book club, I did something I had never done before. I searched through their things. In Vanessa's jewelry box, I found business cards from 3 different real estate agents. In David's desk drawer, I discovered printed emails about home renovation loans, along with a folder labeled Mom's Finances. Inside were photocopies of my bank statements going back 2 years. How had he gotten those? The answer was simple and devastating. He had been planning this for a very long time. Once I knew what to look for, the end came quickly. 3 days later, David sat me down for what he called a serious conversation about your future. Mom, he had clearly prepared a speech. I could tell because his words sounded too smooth, too rehearsed. Vanessa and I have been talking. He began. And we think it would be best for everyone if you moved into assisted living. There's a really nice place called Sunset Manor that has an opening. Sunset Manor, I knew that place. It was where Martha Henderson from church had been sent when her family decided she was too much trouble to care for at home. Martha had died within 6 months, not from illness, but from a broken heart. I don't need assisted living, I said quietly. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. David's patronizing smile made my skin crawl. Mom, you're 64 years old. Last week, you left the stove burner on. Yesterday, you couldn't remember where you put your car keys. Both statements were lies. The stove incident had been him cooking breakfast before work. The car keys were in Vanessa's purse after she borrowed my car for errands. But I didn't bother correcting him. Facts weren't going to matter anymore. And besides, Vanessa added with false sweetness, Sunset Manor has all kinds of activities. Game nights, craft classes, movie screenings. You'd love it there. And what happens to this house? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. David and Vanessa exchanged a quick glance. Well, since it's in my name now, we'll probably sell it, David said. The real estate market is really strong right now. And honestly, Mom, maintaining a house this size is getting expensive. The money from the sale will help pay for your care, help pay for my care. More lies. I had already looked up Sunset Manor's rates online. Even their most expensive private room cost less per month than my house was worth. The rest of the money would vanish into David and Vanessa's renovation plans and future vacations. I need some time to think about this, I said finally. David's expression hardened just slightly. Mom, we're trying to do what's best for you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. 2 days later, I woke up to find all the locks changed. At 7 o'clock in the morning, I stood on my own front porch wearing my nightgown and robe, clutching my purse and the small overnight bag I had packed the night before. Because somewhere deep down, I had known this was coming. David opened the door just wide enough to speak through the gap. I'm sorry, Mom, but this is for your own good, he said. The people from Sunset Manor will be here at 10 to pick you up. There's no point in making a scene. As if a mother expecting to live in her own home was being dramatic. David, please, I said, hating the way my voice trembled. Can we just talk about this? But he was already closing the door through the window. I could see Vanessa in the kitchen, calmly making coffee as if nothing unusual had happened. As if they hadn't just made their own mother homeless. I stood there for 20 minutes, hoping David would come to his senses, hoping this was all some kind of misunderstanding that could be worked out with a conversation. But the Sunset Manor van arrived exactly at 10 o'clock, and in that moment, I knew my old life was over. The 2 attendants were kind but firm as they tried to persuade me to go with them. Double quotes Mrs. Sullivan. The older woman said gently, your son has already completed all the paperwork. Your room is ready, and we have some lovely activities planned for this afternoon. I looked at my house one last time, at the flower garden Tom and I had planted together, at the porch swing where I had read thousands of bedtime stories to David when he was little. Then I turned to the attendants and said the words that changed everything. I'm not going with you. Instead, I walked to my Honda Civic, got inside, and drove away from the only home I had known for 33 years, leaving my son and his wife with exactly what they wanted, the house, and the freedom to pretend I had never existed. Living in your car teaches you things about yourself that you never wanted to know. Like how long you can go without a real shower before even you can't stand your own smell. Like how badly your back can ache from sleeping in a front seat reclined as far as it will go. Like how invisible you become to the rest of the world when you don't have an address. I spent my first night in the parking lot of a 24-hour Walmart, feeling like a criminal every time a security guard walked past. The second night, I tried a rest stop on I-7. But the constant roar of trucks and the fear of what might happen to a lone elderly woman kept me awake until dawn. By the third night, I had found a rhythm. Park behind a Denny's after the dinner rush. Use their restroom before they closed. Buy a coffee and a muffin to justify my presence. Then sleep until the morning staff arrived. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort. It was the shame every time I walked into a store or restaurant. I felt like everyone could tell I was homeless. I'd catch my reflection in windows and see a disheveled woman with gray hair that hadn't been properly styled in a week, wearing the same 3 outfits I had grabbed from my closet that final morning. I looked exactly like what I was, someone who had fallen through the cracks. On the 5th day, I called David. I told myself it was about getting more of my belongings. But deep down, I was hoping he'd come to his senses. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried Vanessa's number with the same result. Finally, out of desperation, I drove past the house. There were painters on the front porch, and through the open windows I could see workers tearing down the wallpaper. In what used to be my dining room, they were already erasing every trace of my existence. The irony was that I wasn't poor. Not really. I had my pension, Social Security, and about $40,000 in savings. But without an address, I couldn't access most of it. Banks don't like dealing with customers who can't provide a permanent residence. Hotels were too expensive for long-term stays. Apartments required credit checks, references, and first and last month's rent up front. Everything in modern life assumes you have a place to call home. By the 10th day, I had settled into a routine that almost felt normal. Coffee and a bathroom stop at McDonald's at 6 in the morning. Showers at the YMCA, where I bought a basic membership and told them I was temporarily between residences. Lunch at the public library, using their Wi-Fi and pretending to read while really just trying to stay warm and clean. Dinner wherever I could find early bird specials. Nursing a single meal for as long as possible. It was at the library on the 14th day that everything changed. I was checking my email when I saw a message from an address I didn't recognize. Sullivan.prises@gmail.com. The subject line read, "Maggie, your brother Bobby." My heart stopped. I hadn't spoken to my brother, Robert, in 3 years, not since Tom's funeral, when he had given a speech about family sticking together through tough times. Bobby was 2 years older than me and had done very well for himself in commercial real estate development. Over the years, we'd grown apart, partly because of distance and partly because his success had always made me feel inadequate. The email was short. Maggie, I heard through the grapevine what happened with David and that house situation. I'm flying into Columbus tomorrow morning. Meet me at the Hilton downtown at noon. We need to talk. Your brother, who should have called sooner. Bobby. I read the message 3 times, trying to figure out who the grapevine was and exactly what Bobby might have heard. More than that, I wondered whether I was ready to face my older brother while I was living in my car and hadn't had a proper meal in 2 days. But pride is a luxury homeless people can't afford. The next day, I put on my last clean outfit and arrived at the Hilton right at noon. Bobby was waiting in the lobby and I barely recognized him. The scrawny kid who used to steal my Halloween candy had grown into a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and he looked like he'd stepped straight out of a business magazine when he saw me. His face shifted into an expression I couldn't quite place: relief, anger, grief, maybe all 3. Jesus. Maggie, he said quietly, pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive cologne and success. What has that little bastard done to you? I had planned to be strong, to pretend I was handling everything just fine. But feeling my brother's arms around me for the first time in years broke something loose inside me. I started crying right there in the fancy hotel lobby and couldn't stop. Bobby guided me to a quiet corner and ordered coffee while I tried to pull myself together. Start from the beginning, he said. And for the next hour, I told him everything: the deed transfer, the conversations I overheard, the changed locks, the 2 weeks of sleeping in my car. With every detail, Bobby's face grew darker. When I finally finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. You know, I made some money over the years, he said at last. I nodded. Bobby's success was family legend. He'd started with a single apartment building in Cleveland in his 20s and built an empire from there. What you probably don't know, he continued, is that I've been watching David for a while. Not spying exactly, just paying attention. He's always struck me as. Bobby paused, searching for the right word. Entitled. Even as a kid, remember Tom's funeral? He asked. I did. David had spent the entire reception complaining about how expensive funerals were, wondering out loud whether I really needed something so elaborate. He cornered me that day. Bobby went on, asking about your finances. How much Tom left you. Whether you had a will. If you'd thought about simplifying your assets. I figured it was just grief talking. But now, Bobby reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. I own 17 rental properties in Columbus, he said. Good neighborhoods. Nice houses. One of them just became available this morning because I told the tenants to find somewhere else to live. He slid the envelope across the table. The keys are in there. So is the deed. The house is yours, free and clear. Consider it back payment for all the Christmas presents I never sent. I stared at the envelope as if it might disappear if I blinked. Bobby, I can't accept. Yes, you can, he interrupted, but that's not all. He pulled out a second envelope, smaller, but somehow heavier. There's a cashier's check in there too. $3 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $3 million. I had never seen that much money written on a check in my life. I don't understand, I whispered. Bobby smiled, and for a moment I saw the mischievous boy who used to help me catch fireflies in our backyard. I'm 66 years old, Maggie. I never had kids. Never found the right woman to settle down with. My money's going to go to someone someday, and I'd rather see what happens when I give it to you while I'm alive so I can enjoy watching. But why now? I asked. His expression hardened again. Because that son of yours is about to learn something important. You don't steal from a Sullivan. We might not talk much, but we're still family and family protects family. He leaned forward. David thinks he's clever, doesn't he? Thinks he played you perfectly. Wait until he finds out his homeless mother just became a millionaire. I looked at the envelopes again, barely daring to believe they were real. What am I supposed to do with $3 million? Bobby's grin turned absolutely wicked. Whatever you want, little sister. But if I were you, I'd start by making sure David knows exactly what he threw away when he changed those locks. The house Bobby gave me was in Upper Arlington, one of Columbus's most prestigious neighborhoods. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, hardwood floors throughout, a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a home design magazine. It was twice the size of the house I'd shared with Tom and 100 times more luxurious than anything I had ever imagined living in. I spent my first week there just wandering from room to room, touching the surfaces and opening cabinets, trying to convince myself it was all real. The master bedroom had a walk-in closet bigger than some apartments. The living room featured a fireplace with a marble mantel and built-in bookshelves that stretched all the way to the ceiling. The backyard had a garden that would make any retired teacher weep with joy. But the most satisfying part was getting my new financial life in order. Bobby had recommended a wealth management firm, and I spent an afternoon with a very serious young man named Christopher. He explained investment portfolios and interest rates with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. With conservative investments, he told me, you could easily live on $200,000 a year without touching the principal. $200,000 a year, more than triple what I'd ever made at the peak of my teaching career, and more than David earned at his engineering job. The irony was delicious. While he was renovating my old house to flip it for maybe $700,000 in profit, I was sitting on enough money to buy 10 houses just like it. I bought new clothes first. Nothing flashy or extravagant, just well-made pieces that fit properly and made me feel like myself again. Then I bought a new car, trading in my Honda Civic for a silver Lexus that drove like a cloud and had more technology than the space shuttle. The salesman kept glancing from my driver's license to my cashier's check, clearly wondering how a retired teacher could afford a $60,000 car. But I was still the same Maggie Sullivan who had taught 3rd grade for 30 years. I couldn't just sit in my beautiful new house spending money aimlessly. I needed a purpose, a plan. And slowly, sitting in my new kitchen with my morning coffee, watching cardinals at the bird feeder Bobby had already installed in the backyard, that plan began to take shape. It started one afternoon when I drove past my old house. The painters were gone, but landscapers were working on the front yard, and a dumpster out front was filled with what looked like my old furniture. I parked across the street and watched for a while, noting the expensive cars in the driveway: David's BMW and Vanessa's Range Rover. Both newer than I remembered. They were spending money they hadn't even made yet, so confident in their real estate flip that they were already living like people who'd struck it rich. That's when I realized David had made a crucial mistake. He assumed that getting rid of me meant he'd won. He thought I was broken and defeated, probably living in some small, sad apartment, licking my wounds and accepting my fate. He had no idea that his desperate, homeless mother had not only landed on her feet, but had landed in a level of luxury beyond his wildest dreams, which meant he had no idea what was coming. I drove home and opened my laptop, spending the rest of the evening researching everything I could find about my son's finances. What I uncovered made my plan even sweeter. David and Vanessa weren't just living beyond their means, they were drowning in debt. Credit cards, car payments, a second mortgage on an investment property that wasn't paying off. They needed my house to sell quickly and for top dollar, or they were heading straight for serious financial trouble. I smiled as I closed my laptop. David thought he'd been clever manipulating his naive old mother, but he'd forgotten something important about teachers were very good at long-term planning, and I was about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. 3 weeks into my new life as a secret millionaire, I was having coffee with my neighbor Jana when she casually mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Oh, by the way," she said, "I ran into your son, David, at the grocery store yesterday. Such a charming young man. He was telling me how worried he's been about you since you moved into that assisted living facility." I nearly choked on my coffee. Assisted living facility. So that was the story David was telling people. Not that he'd locked his mother out of her own home, but that loving, concerned David had helped his aging mother transition into professional care. The narrative was so perfect, so believable, that even Jana, who had known me for 15 years, had accepted it without question. "He seemed so relieved that you're getting proper care," Jana continued. "He said you'd been having some memory issues and that it wasn't safe for you to live alone anymore." Memory issues? I wanted to laugh at the audacity, but instead I simply smiled and murmured something non-committal about adjusting to my new living situation. Let David think his story was working. Let him believe he'd covered all his bases. That afternoon, I called a private investigator Bobby had recommended. Patricia Reynolds was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in financial fraud cases. "I need to know everything about my son's business dealings," I told her. "Every debt, every asset, every financial move he's made in the past 5 years." Patricia quoted a fee that would have seemed astronomical to me 6 months earlier, but now felt like pocket change. "One more thing," I added. "I need to know about the house, my house. What they're really planning to do with it." Patricia nodded as she made notes. "Most people think they're smarter than they actually are when it comes to covering their tracks," she said. "Give me 2 weeks." While Patricia did her work, I did mine. I contacted Harold Weinstein, my old attorney, and asked him to quietly look into whether there was any legal recourse for the way the deed transfer had been handled. "Maggie," Harold said carefully, "elder abuse cases are complicated, especially when family members are involved. But if we can prove fraud or undue influence..." He let the rest of the sentence hang in the air. At the same time, I began cultivating my new image as the tragic mother. I joined a support group for seniors dealing with family estrangement. I volunteered at the library where I had spent so many of my homeless days, making sure to mention to other volunteers how difficult it had been to adjust to assisted living. After my son decided it was best for everyone, I was careful never to sound angry, only sad and confused. A woman who couldn't quite understand how she had ended up separated from her family. The beauty of the performance was that most of it was true. I was sad. I was confused about how my own son could betray me so completely. The only lie was where I was living, and that lie served a larger truth. David really had tried to force me into assisted living. He really had stolen my house. And he really had abandoned me when I needed him most. 2 weeks later, Patricia called with a report that exceeded my wildest expectations. "Your son is in serious financial trouble," she began. "He and his wife have $700,000 in debt, spread across 14 different credit cards and loans. They've been relying on balance transfers and cash advances to stay afloat. But they're running out of options." She paused to let it sink in. "They need that house to sell for at least $800,000, or they're looking at bankruptcy within 6 months. But that wasn't the most interesting part of her report. "There's something else," Patricia said. "The renovation work on your old house. They're cutting corners in ways that could be dangerous. Unlicensed electrical work, unpermitted plumbing changes, structural modifications that haven't been inspected." She let the implication hang. "If the right person were to report this to the city..." I thanked Patricia and ended the call, my mind racing. David wasn't just greedy and cruel. He was desperate and stupid. He had backed himself into a corner where everything had to go perfectly, with no room for mistakes or bad luck. It would be such a shame if his luck suddenly changed. The anonymous tip I made to the Columbus Building Department came from a payphone at a gas station. I used a voice slightly shakier and older than my own. "I'm concerned about the construction work at 1247 Maple Street," I told the inspector who answered. "There are workers there at all hours and I'm not sure they have the proper permits. As a neighbor, I'm worried about safety issues." The inspector assured me they would look into it. 3 days later, I drove past the house and saw a city truck parked in my old driveway, with 2 officials holding clipboards as they walked the property. From behind the tinted windows of my new car, I watched David standing on the front porch, his face flushed with what I assumed was a mix of anger and panic. But that was only the opening move. The real strategy required patience and much better timing. Over the next week, I studied David and Vanessa's routine. Something that would have felt unthinkably creepy 6 months earlier now felt like necessary intelligence gathering. They left for work at the same time every morning, came home around 6:30, and went out every Friday night to what appeared to be the same upscale restaurant downtown. I also began making carefully timed appearances around town. At the Kroger where David shopped, I ran into his co-worker, Jim Peterson. He mentioned how stressed David had been lately over some family situation involving his mother. I played my role, perfectly sighing softly about how hard it was to adjust to assisted living and how much I missed my old life. David seems like such a good son, though, Jim said. He's always talking about wanting what's best for his mother. I smiled wistfully and agreed that David had always been thoughtful, letting Jim draw his own conclusions about the kind of man who puts his loving mother in assisted living while selling her house. The building department citation arrived at David's workplace on a Tuesday. Patricia had uncovered that he'd listed his office address on all the construction permits, which meant the notice landed directly on his desk. The violations were extensive: electrical work that didn't meet code, plumbing changes that required inspection, and structural modifications that needed engineer approval. All construction had to stop immediately until everything was brought into compliance. I knew about the citation because I'd made a habit of driving past the house every afternoon, around 4 o'clock. I told myself it was just curiosity, but really, it was a form of psychological torture. For David, not for me. I was enjoying every moment. The construction crews vanished overnight. The coming soon real estate sign that had gone up the week before was quietly taken down. That Friday evening, instead of heading to their usual upscale restaurant, David and Vanessa stayed home. At 7 o'clock, I parked across the street and watched through their brightly lit windows as what looked like a very heated argument unfolded in my former living room. Vanessa paced back and forth, gesturing wildly, while David sat slumped in a chair with his head buried in his hands. I wondered what they were saying to each other. Were they blaming one another for the permit problems? Calculating how much the delays were going to cost them? Finally realizing that their carefully planned financial crime was starting to unravel? I hoped it was all three. The next morning, I received a call that made my entire week. It was Harold Weinstein, calling with news about the legal research I'd asked him to do. Maggie, I've been reviewing the circumstances surrounding your deed transfer, he said. If we can show that you were coerced, or that David misrepresented the nature of the documents you were signing, we may have grounds for a lawsuit. More importantly, we might be able to void the transfer entirely. Void the transfer. The words were beautiful. David could pour money into renovating that house. He could take on all the debt he wanted to finance his project. And in the end, I could potentially reclaim legal ownership, leaving him with nothing but a pile of unpaid bills. But somehow that felt too easy to clean. David deserved something more creative, more personal, more devastating. He deserved to suffer the way he had made me suffer, to feel as helpless and betrayed as I had felt standing on my own front porch with nowhere to go. That was when I began planning the final phase of my revenge, the part that would require perfect timing and absolutely no mercy. The first sign that David was cracking came through Jana, who spotted him at the hardware store looking completely haggard. According to her gossip network, he'd been there 3 times in 1 week, buying materials one day, returning them the next. Financial troubles, Jana whispered knowingly. You can always tell. People start making impulsive purchases they can't afford, then panic about the cost. Thanks to Patricia's continued monitoring, I knew exactly what those financial troubles were. The permit delays had already cost David 2 months of construction time and somewhere around $50,000 in rework and inspection fees. His credit cards were maxed out. He'd borrowed against his $401k. He'd even taken out a title loan on his BMW. But the most delicious detail was what Patricia uncovered about his timeline. David had already signed a contract with a buyer contingent on the renovation being completed by December 1st. If the house wasn't ready by then, he wouldn't just lose the sale. He'd also owe a penalty fee of $50,000, with the permit issues piling up. Finishing by December 1st was becoming increasingly impossible. Meanwhile, I was living my best life. I joined a book club. I started piano lessons for the first time since I was 12. I even began planning a trip to Italy for the spring. The money Bobby had given me wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming a life I had forgotten I wanted. Every morning, I woke up in my beautiful house and remembered that I was free in ways I had never been before. But freedom, I was learning also meant the freedom to be absolutely ruthless when the situation called for it. Which is why, when David finally reached out to me, I was ready. The call came on a Thursday evening in early November. I was reading in my living room when my phone rang, and David's name appeared on the screen for the first time in 2 months. I let it ring 3 times before answering, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Hello. David, Mom. His voice sounded strained, exhausted. Mom, I need to talk to you. I know things have been complicated between us, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. As if locking me out of my own house was some kind of simple communication error that could be fixed with a heart-to-heart conversation. I'm listening, I said quietly. David took a shaky breath. The thing is, Mom, David said, there are some problems with the house renovation. Legal issues I didn't anticipate. And I was wondering if there might be any way you could help us financially with some of the unexpected costs, help them financially. The audacity took my breath away. The son who had made me homeless was now calling to ask me for money. What kind of help are you talking about, David? I asked, letting just a trace of my old maternal concern slip into my voice. Maybe $50,000, he said quickly. Just temporarily until we get the house sold. I know assisted living is expensive, but if you have any savings left or if you could take out a loan against your pension. He was babbling now, desperation making him careless. David, I interrupted gently. I'm living in assisted living on a fixed income. I don't have $50,000. It wasn't technically a lie. I didn't have $50,000. I had $3 million, but David didn't need to know that. The silence stretched on for nearly 30 seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was harder now. Mom, you have to understand. If this renovation fails, Vanessa and I could lose everything. Our cars, our credit. Maybe even our jobs if we have to declare bankruptcy. You're my mother. Doesn't that mean anything to you? And there it was. The same manipulation he had used to get me to sign over the deed. The same emotional blackmail wrapped up in talk of family obligation, except this time, I wasn't a lonely widow desperate to stay connected to her only child. This time, I had options. David, I said quietly, I think you should come visit me. We should have this conversation in person. He agreed immediately, probably thinking he'd have a better chance of manipulating me face to face. We arranged for him to come by the following Saturday afternoon. After I hung up, I sat in my elegant living room and smiled. David thought he was coming to convince a desperate old woman to bail him out of the mess he'd created. Instead, he was walking straight into the final act of a play I had been directing for months. Saturday couldn't come soon enough. Then, Saturday morning, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was Patricia Reynolds. And the information she shared was so explosive I had to sit down while she explained it. Maggie, there's something else you need to know about your son's financial situation, she said. That house renovation, it's not just about cutting corners on permits. David took out a construction loan using fraudulent income statements. He claimed he was making twice what he actually earns. Bank fraud. David hadn't just betrayed his mother. He had committed multiple felonies. There's more, Patricia continued. I found records showing that he's been forging your signature on documents even after you moved out. He's been taking cash advances on credit cards opened in your name, using your old address as the contact information. Identity theft, forgery. My son hadn't just stolen my house. He had been systematically destroying my credit and my name for months. I felt physically sick thinking about what could have happened if Bobby hadn't rescued me, if I had been trapped in assisted living while David ruined my financial reputation and racked up debt in my name. How much? I asked quietly. Patricia's pause told me everything so far. About $200,000 across 8 different accounts. But Maggie, here's the thing. If you report this to the authorities, David wouldn't just face civil penalties. He'd be looking at serious federal charges: mail fraud, identity theft, bank fraud. We're talking about potential prison time. Prison time. The word should have shocked me. But instead I felt a cold satisfaction settle deep in my bones. David had crossed every line, violated every trust, committed crimes that went far beyond simple family betrayal. He had gambled that his homeless, powerless mother would never find out about the systematic destruction of her identity and credit. He had gambled wrong. I thanked Patricia and spent the rest of the morning thinking David would be at my door in just a few hours, expecting to manipulate his elderly mother into bailing him out of a crisis he had created. He had no idea that his elderly mother was now wealthy beyond his imagination, and in possession of evidence that could send him to federal prison. At exactly 2 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. I had dressed carefully for this moment, choosing clothes that looked respectable but not expensive. When I opened the door, David was standing there holding a bouquet of white roses, the same flowers he had brought to his father's funeral. His face was thinner than I remembered, and dark circles under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights and mounting desperation. "Hi, Mom," he said, offering the flowers with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You look good. Assisted living seems to be agreeing with you." I accepted the roses without comment and invited him inside, watching his face closely as he took in my living space for the first time. His reaction was everything I had hoped for. David's mouth literally fell open as he looked around my elegant living room, the marble fireplace, the expensive furnishings, all of it. "Mom," he said slowly, "this doesn't look like assisted living. This looks like..." He trailed off, unable to process what he was seeing. "Like what, David?" I asked pleasantly, settling into my favorite armchair and gesturing for him to sit on the sofa. He didn't move. Instead, he turned in a slow circle, taking in the high ceilings, the hardwood floors, the crystal chandelier that had probably cost more than his car. "This looks like a millionaire's house," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I smiled and reached for the tea service I had prepared earlier, taking my time with the ritual of pouring and adding sugar. David remained frozen in the middle of the room, clearly trying to understand how his homeless mother had ended up living in luxury beyond his wildest dreams. "David," I said calmly, "we need to talk about the credit cards you've been opening in my name, the construction loan you fraudulently obtained using fake income statements, and the $200,000 you've stolen from me." Over the past 8 months, the white roses slipped from his nerveless fingers and scattered across my Persian rug like snow. Silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity as David's face cycled through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, realization, panic, and finally a kind of desperate calculation. I could almost see his mind racing, trying to figure out how much I knew and whether there was any way to talk himself out of the corner he had painted himself into. "Mom," he said at last, his voice carefully controlled, "I think there's been some confusion. If there are financial irregularities, I can explain everything. The construction loan paperwork was complicated, and maybe there were some errors." I raised my hand to stop him, and something in my expression made him fall silent immediately. "David, sit down. It wasn't a request." He sank onto the sofa like a marionette with its strings cut. I took a moment to study my son's face. When had he become such a stranger? When had the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard turned into a man who could look me in the eye while systematically destroying my life? "I know about all of it," I said quietly. "The fake income statements, the credit cards opened in my name, the forged signatures, the $200,000 you've stolen over the past 8 months. I know about the building code violations, the unpermitted work, the buyer's contract that expires in 3 weeks. I know you're facing bankruptcy if that house doesn't sell. And I know you've committed multiple federal crimes along the way." David's face went ashen. "How could you possibly know all that?" I smiled because, "David, I'm not the helpless old woman you thought you were manipulating. I'm not living in assisted living. I'm not struggling on a fixed income. And I'm not the same person who signed over her house deed because she was desperate for her son's love and approval." I stood and walked to the window, looking out over my beautiful garden. "Would you like to know where I've been living since you locked me out of my own house? Would you like to know how I went from homeless to living in a home worth more than yours in the span of 6 weeks?" David said nothing, but I could feel his eyes following my every move. "Your Uncle Bobby gave me this house, David, free and clear. No mortgage, no strings attached. He also gave me $3 million to start over." I turned back to face him and watched all the color drain from his face. $3 million. "David, more money than you'll make in your entire lifetime even if you manage to avoid prison." "Prison?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. I returned to my chair and picked up the manila folder I had placed on the side table earlier. "Bank fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, forgery, according to my attorney. You're looking at potentially 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Not to mention complete financial ruin and the certainty that you'll never work in engineering again." David was shaking now, his hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "Mom, please. I can explain everything: the financial pressure, the debt, the fear of losing everything we worked for." "Everything you worked for?" I interrupted. "David, you worked for nothing. You stole everything. You stole my house. You stole my money. You stole my identity. And you tried to steal my dignity by telling everyone I was a confused old woman who needed assisted living." I opened the folder and spread Patricia's investigation report across the coffee table. Between us, bank statements, forged documents, credit applications, loan paperwork. The evidence was overwhelming. "David, You left a paper trail that a first-year law student could follow, I said evenly. You were so confident that your stupid mother would never find out what you were doing, that you got careless. He stared at the documents for a long moment before finally looking up at me. What do you want? He asked, his voice hollow. It was the question I'd been waiting for, the moment when my son finally understood that the balance of power between us had shifted completely and permanently. What do I want? I repeated thoughtfully. I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything that matters to you. I want you to know what it's like to be betrayed by the person you trusted most in the world. I want you to experience the helplessness and desperation you forced me to live with. I closed the folder and smiled. The good news, David, is that I'm not going to send you to prison. I'm not calling the FBI. I'm not pressing charges or destroying your life. The way you tried to destroy mine, relief washed over his face so intensely that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The bad news, I continued, is that I'm also not going to help you. Not with money. Not with loans. Not with anything. You're going to face the consequences of your choices all by yourself, just like you forced me to do. I stood up. Your house renovation will fail. You'll lose your buyer. You'll face bankruptcy. And you'll have no one to blame but yourself. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. Those are beautiful roses, David, I said, glancing down at the scattered flowers on my rug. White roses for new beginnings. How fitting. This is definitely a new beginning for both of us. I met his eyes. The difference is that mine includes $3 million. And the most beautiful house in Upper Arlington. Yours includes bankruptcy, professional ruin, and the knowledge that the mother you threw away like garbage is living better than you ever will. David stumbled to his feet and walked toward the door like a man in a trance. When he reached the threshold, he turned back one last time. Mom. I'm sorry, he said, for the first time since he'd arrived. His voice sounded like the little boy I had once loved unconditionally. I know you are, David. I replied gently. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry your plan failed. You're sorry you underestimated me. But you're not sorry you tried to destroy me, because if you had succeeded, you'd be celebrating right now instead of apologizing. I closed the door and locked it. Then I returned to my living room, where the scattered white roses were the only evidence that my son had ever been there at all. Through the window, I watched him drive away in his BMW, probably for the last time before the bank repossessed it. Then I called Bobby to tell him the good news. David's lesson was complete, and justice had finally been served. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.